All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is Creating a Modern Development Culture with AWS. My name is Mike Deck. I'm joined today by Carmen Puccio. We are both principal solutions architects on the partner team, where we both work on a team that focuses on our partner community that helps our customers modernize their application development practices. I focus specifically on our serverless platform. Carmen is focused on containers, and we work with a number of different consulting and ISV partners in that space. And we'll be talking to you today a little bit about how you can create a modern development culture within your organization. So to kick things off, I wanted to tell a little bit of a story from my past. So when I first started off in the industry, when I got right out of college and was in one of my first jobs as a programmer, I was developing a system. I was on a team that was developing this system. It had a UI component and server component. It allowed kind of our internal users to do scheduling and manage accounts and things like that. And at one point, we ended up changing the UI framework that we were using. And shortly after we made that change, this bug started to occur where the screen would flicker in certain circumstances. There'd be weird cases where the system was under higher load than usual. And basically all of the UI elements would start redrawing themselves, and the screen would flash and it would be this really weird kind of user experience. So we got a report of this bug, and we kind of hacked in a fix and made something to where we thought it would work. But then after we deployed that, it came back a few weeks later, and we continued to see this over and over again. We would constantly go in, fix the bug, we get a new report that there was a problem, and eventually it got so common that people started to refer to this as the Christmas bug, because it looked like there were all of these flashing lights, like a Christmas light show. And so the ops team would tell the development team that, oh, Christmas is back, or users would report to us that the Christmas bug is happening to me again. And at the time, I never really thought a whole lot of it. We would sort of get these bug reports, we'd go in and we'd again kind of hack in some fix, and in some cases we even would put sleeps into the code to delay the repainting of the UI, and just never really ended up solving the root cause of the problem. And I moved on. I honestly don't know what happened to the system itself, but in thinking back on this, now that I've had a little bit more experience, what I think is interesting is if you start to kind of ask the 5 whys for why was this really happening, and what would we have needed to change to really fix this at a fundamental level. Initially the first few whys that you would ask would be about, like, well, why was this happening? It was because this UI framework that we were using, we were probably doing something wrong at a technical level. We weren't really using the libraries the way that they were intended. And why was that happening? Well, it was because we didn't really understand how this UI framework worked, and it was kind of dictated to us to use this. It really wasn't our choice as to how we wanted to kind of design the system. And then you start asking more whys, and I think you start to realize, or at least in this case, that the underlying problem that was preventing us from really doing this is, one, that we weren't held accountable for the fact that we had this same bug recurring over and over and over again. This was not viewed by our organization as being a critical problem, when it really should have been a major red flag that there was something fundamentally wrong with the design of our system, or the way that we were going about building this thing, given the fact we could never really get this resolved. And I think even more fundamental to that was just the fact that there was this misalignment between our priorities and what should have been our overall organizational priorities, because we were in this very siloed kind of organization that didn't give us kind of the end-to-end ownership that I think would have encouraged us and would have driven the right behaviors for us to make kind of the fundamental changes that we should have been making. So today's webinar, we're gonna talk a little bit about the individuals and interactions over processes and tools. This concept from the Agile Manifesto that talks about, while there's value in the things on the right, we value the things on the left more. If you've ever read the Agile Manifesto, it sets up, a number of pairs of these different kind of value systems. And so what I think is interesting is, a lot of times when people get started building new cloud-based applications and thinking about how they're going to leverage various AWS services. They get really, really focused on all of the different cool tools and services and processes that are available to them. But I think even more important than all of those pieces is making sure that first you have kind of the individuals and interactions, the cultural and organizational elements in place in order to take best advantage of all of these different new tools and services that are available. And so that's really what we want to talk about today. So I think the real question that you have to start off with is, well, do we have a legacy development culture? Do we have cultural problems? And so I'd like to hand it over to Carmen at this point. And Carmen, can you talk a little bit about your experience working with customers, with these kinds of cultural issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I mean, just a little bit of context as well, just to kind of set the stage. One of the things that I focused on when I first joined AWS was to work as part of the AWS mass migrations team. So we were out there, and that team is still out there. I've since moved on to focus on our container partners, but we were essentially out there trying to figure out how to take customers' legacy IT real estate and move it over to AWS at scale. Like, what are the best practices? How do I do it quickly? How do I do it in a repeatable manner? And how do we set the customer up for success, right? So a lot of times what we saw were the symptoms that you see right here, right? So, looking at this slide, I think it's very apparent that you want to avoid these symptoms. No organization wants these symptoms, because in the end, it's not only hurting just the customers, it's hurting the businesses and the employees as well. So for instance, if maybe Mike was our product owner and he came to us and he asked for a relatively simple feature, it's unrealistic for him to wait weeks or even months for that feature to essentially be released. And if you compound that with essentially a lack of confidence from him, maybe because he's seen bugs in the past or other operational issues with prior release, and what you'll start to see is frustration at an organizational level. And when this happens, corners will start getting cut, right? A lot of times you'll start seeing people kind of cut corners. And what happens is essentially this makes things worse over time. And then as you further go down this wormhole, this leads to this conservative mindset from your teams, which is unfortunate, because what you'll start seeing, and I saw this, is they essentially become risk adverse, right? Or maybe they're incapable of accepting change. And sometimes the worst one is essentially they're complacent with the idea that things are essentially acceptable in their current state. And what you want to avoid is that mindset of essentially this is how things are just done around here. So when we go down a little further into why this is an actual problem, it is really about reacting to change. And we talk about survival in today's business, and we talk about the cloud, and we talk about rapid innovation. And it's true, right? In order to survive, you have to innovate as rapidly as possible to stay competitive. And the faster you build and innovate, the happier customers will be. And with that legacy development mindset we were talking about, your developers and operational teams, they end up wasting those unnecessary cycles on things like long release cycles, or patch management, or manual deployments, or chasing down those operational issues and bugs, instead of focusing on how to really deliver what's an exceptional application for their customers, right? That's what they want to deliver at the end of the day, but they're wasting their time on all of those unnecessary things. And what that ends up being, and what we talked about a lot in the mass migration team, was essentially technical debt. And you'll hear technical debt in many different facets, but I like to think of it essentially, that's essentially, whether it's software based or part of the legacy IT operations, it's something that builds up over time. Because teams choose to go for the simpler solution now, instead of that better approach that would take longer, right? So, this can typically be attributed to things, and it's a long list, but maybe it's like budget constraints, or tight timelines, or maybe the QA teams don't have a really good test suite, or maybe there's, I don't know, like a lack of resources, right? The team's not big enough. And that's just a few of the things that essentially, contribute to that. But regardless of the reason, it's something that many teams struggle with as part of dealing with legacy applications, which essentially leads to the question. It's like, we heard this all the time as well. It's like, well, how do I eliminate my technical debt? If I move to the cloud, does it go away? And you often hear that it helps you eliminate it, and it helps you modernize your business. And this is 100% true. The cloud will help you reduce your infrastructure deployment costs. It'll help you decrease your maintenance costs. It will help create that standardization, when you leverage automation and you empower your teams. But what it does require is it requires a tremendous amount of proper planning. So as part of what we instilled with our customers as we were working with them and trying to teach them how to migrate at scale was essentially, the planning aspect and making sure that you lay the groundwork and thinking about all of the operational constructs and how your teams will work together cohesively. Those are the things that we taught them in order to, start to chunk away at that technical debt as they moved applications over.
Great. So, with that kind of context in place, I guess the next question is, what are the key differentiators between this kind of legacy development culture and the new modern culture that we're trying to build? So the way that I typically think about it is I think that the legacy mindset is characterized primarily by this idea that there are handoffs that are happening between disparate teams. So whether that's your development team handing off to a QA team, and then that has to go through a security review, and then eventually to the ops team to build and manage it. There's kind of these different siloed organizations that are all handing off artifacts between one another. And what that ends up leading to is this focus on process above all else. So ultimately, developers are worried about, hey, can I make this work on my machine or in my dev environment? And then they hand that off to the next team down the road and move on to the next thing that they're working on. And there's very much this kind of obsession with how do we kind of move a task through our own isolated process internally so that we can hand this over to the next team. And then ultimately, what ends up happening is now all of these various teams throughout this chain create gates to keep things out of production is kind of their fundamental role. That's ultimately the QA team's job is to say, no, this is not ready to go to production yet. The security team's job is to say, no, this is not ready to go to production yet. So you end up with this kind of gated mindset where you're constantly trying to push things through. Everyone views all of the other teams that they're working with as essentially obstacles to ultimately kind of pushing things out in production. So you end up with all of these symptoms and problems that Carmen discussed. So contrast that with a culture in which you're encouraging teams to own the process end to end. Everything from writing the code, building and managing it, all the way through to operating the service in production is owned by one consolidated team. And what this gives them the ability to do then is really to focus on their customers and use process as a mechanism to provide customer value. So now instead of being focused just on, hey, I've got to review I've got to get this code reviewed by our security team and kind of push it through. The question becomes, how do we build a more secure application that better serves our customers? And those customers may be external entities, customers of the business overall, or they may be internal customers. But either way, the team itself now is kind of has this broader scope and alignment between their accountability and their authority to make changes. And then the final kind of piece of that then is that it leads to this more cross-functional collaboration as opposed to this kind of inherent competition between teams or inherent adversarial relationship that you get between these various different teams that are all essentially set up to have to say no to one another. So I think the real key, the overarching goal here is to build the kind of culture in which you are able to have teams that own full services, that have an alignment between the authority that they have to make decisions about how do we need to change the architecture, how should we be automating the deployments, how should we be incorporating the security practices that are defined by our company into our design and release process and all of the rest of those kind of considerations. Giving teams that authority, but then also holding them accountable to meeting those goals and setting SLAs and meeting those and keeping that measure. So ultimately, that's kind of the end state that I think we're talking about how we can get to.
Yeah, absolutely. So like to kind of further touch on that, right? So when we talk about the overall goals, and Mike hit it, right? Like you have that goal where essentially you want your teams to be empowered and you want them to be able to own the application lifecycle from, essentially, business idea all the way through to production. And you always hear about the ability that the cloud gives you, right? It enables you to fail fast. It enables you to quickly learn from your mistakes as you experiment. And that's okay, right? You have to instill that culture into your team, because the easiest kind of innovation to drive is lots of incremental change with lots of experiments. So that's much easier to do than to wait until you make one massive change, because you can get all these little iterations in and you can learn faster from your mistakes if you work in small chunks. So one of the key goals when it comes to modernizing your development practice is to shorten that time from idea to production. And as part of that process, your teams really need to realize that in order to shorten that time of a release cycle, they need to accept the fact that they can minimize risk. But it doesn't mean that risk is altogether eliminated. Just because you're working in these little small, cycles or pockets, it's not necessarily, that you're not going to encounter any issues. What it means is that if you've spent more time creating that automated workflow that helps you minimize risk and mitigate it, allowing quick resolution before your customers are affected once you've actually pushed that button into releasing the software into production. So you want to focus on how you can continuously evolve your systems and your teams by implementing automation and essentially creating like a feedback loop, right? That goes back to your development and operational teams. And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of pizza teams in the upcoming slides. But if you think about the software release cycle, or the typical software release cycle, and all of the steps that are required to go from business idea to development to QA to staging to production, it's a very similar process, but it's more about the automation workflow that occurs during those steps. So your development teams will still need to work on features or user stories, but they're broken down into those smaller chunks, or you'll sometimes hear the term feature branches. And what this means is essentially you want them promoting the practice of checking in often, and you want them testing those changes, even though they've been integrated into your main branch, sometimes numerous times per day, or we've seen customers do upwards of 50 releases per hour, right? And through the process of CI/CD, what you're going to do is you're going to create that continually improving system to get to a point where, regardless of the change or even who made it, you can receive immediate feedback on that production release for that feature, so you understand what's happening at any given point.
Great. So, one of the things that we commonly hear from customers when we talk about these types of topics is, how does Amazon do this? How have you guys been successful in implementing this? Or, do you follow, is this coming based on your own experience, or is this something that you guys are preaching without practicing? And so I think it's important to understand a little bit of the context around how we do things here at Amazon. So, one of the examples that I think is good to take a look at is kind of how Amazon's services have evolved over the course of the last 20 or so years. So Amazon was founded in 1994. At the time, it was a website where you could buy books. Now, over the course of the years, that sort of product and service mix has changed dramatically to not only selling books, but to eventually selling physical media for music and videos. Eventually, we launched a streaming service where you could listen to music online, and now there are millions of Echo devices throughout the world where customers can listen to their favorite music just by asking Alexa to play their favorite band. Now, what I think is interesting is this exact same example we've seen happen dozens, if not hundreds of times throughout the business. There's many different examples that we can point to where the market in which we're operating and the products that we're selling to customers have changed dramatically over the course of a relatively short timeline. And the kind of secret sauce to how we've been able to manage that and how we've been able to move as quickly as we have isn't based on the amazing engineering solutions that we've come up with or some ingenious architectural breakthroughs that we've made. I think there are certainly some amazing solutions and amazing technical talent at Amazon that we've encapsulated into our services and products. But the underlying kind of secret sauce that I think has really allowed us to make the right decisions and to build those right solutions and to innovate at a pace that allows us to keep up with the rate of change within this market is really that underlying cultural shift that we made in order to support lots of different teams all innovating very quickly and building a culture in which that type of innovation was easy to cultivate. So Carmen, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of some of the structure around how we do that with the concept of two pizza teams.
Yeah, yeah. So you may have heard the term before, but essentially, we have this term here at Amazon, and we call them two pizza teams, right? And the belief is this: it's that a smaller, more self-directed team is essentially nimbler than your more traditional teams. So, on a large team, it's difficult to understand and communicate with all of the individuals throughout the team, which will always lead to communication breakdown. Right. So the bigger your team gets, essentially the easier it is to lose an understanding of who's doing what and when things are taking place. Right. And moreover, the larger the group, the more process that's typically introduced, which will always slow things down from, in terms of the teams delivering. Right. So this concept of a two pizza team is large enough where collaboration and knowledge sharing are still occurring, but it's small enough where everyone on the team has a high level of awareness of everyone else's on the team's effort, right? They have a full understanding of what's going on. And people always throw this thing out there like, well, how big is it, right? And there's really no set number. Typically what we'll see is maybe 6 or 7, but it's in reality no more than 10. But again, those are rough numbers. But when you're forming your two pizza team, you can think about the structure the following way, right? You always want your business owner as the leader. And what that means to a technical team is that your programmers and operational teams or QA teams are essentially the customer, but they're also the implementer, meaning they're helping write the specifications of what's going into place with this change, right? And then at the same time, they're implementing the specification, right? The team is essentially autonomous, and their interaction with other teams inside the company is typically limited. But when it does occur, it's very well documented, right? So in other words, the team is composed of nearly everything it needs and can make all of its changes without regard or impact to other teams' work or schedules or whatever it may be. It owns every aspect of its system, right? And for pizza teams to really truly be independent, their systems need to be independent, right? So we're all here just understanding how we can make microservices and all the cool things around it, right? The one thing we talk about when it's the technical pizza team, the general rule is their code should depend only on the platform and not other teams' application code. And what that means is you're not sharing packages, right? So when a pizza team, essentially they interact with other teams, they should be doing so over published APIs. And any APIs they use are obviously published, but they also need to provide APIs to other systems as well, right? And this really pushes them to, essentially document and harden their APIs. And since they don't have that shared code, the APIs will have explicit interfaces, and people always say like, well, what about databases? And it's fine, right? So a pizza team will own its own database, but it's not accessed by any service that's not part of the service itself, right? With the exception, maybe a data warehouse or some ETL operation, and that type of data, again, you're still going over that published API route, right? So the pizza team is essentially free to change the schema of the database that they own at will using whatever process that they like. And then, not to shortchange it, but reporting is very important as well. Since they own this holistic application and they own all of the moving pieces inside of it, reporting is very important. So the pizza team is responsible for adding the instrumentation to their systems to generate all of the metrics they need to essentially show that they're operating not only independently, but providing that level of transparency into their system, so individuals can get aligned and they can all move together as a cohesive team. So that's essentially the high level, term pizza team and what it means to us in terms for the teams to be a little bit more nimble and work independently.
Yeah. I think those are all great points, and Carmen talked a little bit about this idea of having well-defined APIs and microservices that are kind of owned by each of these teams. And I think it's important to really understand this architectural construct of a microservice through the lens of kind of the cultural shift that we're talking about today. So microservices certainly have a number of architectural advantages. We talk a lot about, being able to deploy them independently. You can scale them more easily. You're decoupling various components that may have different kind of scaling requirements. You can decouple from a fault zone perspective. But when it comes to the kind of cultural shifts that we're talking about, and again, this idea of aligning authority and accountability, microservices as an architectural construct become very important in order to provide those strong delineations between the responsibilities of all of these various independent teams and give them kind of that sandbox, give them that boundary where inside of this well-defined microservice boundary, they're able to innovate very, very quickly and rapidly. So this gives your teams the ability now to go in, make decisions based on what they see their customers needing, and their customers in these cases are the people that are consuming the services they're providing. Make changes to those, deploy them, get them out the door as quickly as they possibly can. Now, in addition to that, in addition to being able to have that authority to make those changes quickly, this also gives you the ability now to measure things and observe your system and hold all of these different teams accountable to ensuring that they're not going out and breaking other downstream systems, and that they're not that they're not having outages or functional problems with their system. All of these things now can be measured and observed, and you can again build this kind of reinforcement from a cultural perspective around this idea that this team is end-to-end responsible for ensuring that this service does what it says it's supposed to do and meets all of the various SLAs and requirements that we've put in place. Now, when it comes to building microservices and deploying them, there are a couple of different options that you've got from kind of a technical perspective that, again, I think have some impact on how you think about this from a cultural perspective. So I guess, Carmen, why don't you talk a little bit about the different AWS services that come into play here?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll see containers and serverless here, and to be honest, right, it's not one versus the other, and Mike will attest to this. It's very commonplace to see organizations take advantage of essentially both, right? But at its highest level, and we're going to get into this in the subsequent webinar we're going to do next week. But when it comes to containers, right, it's a very hot topic, and it's essentially I like to attribute it to, if a customer wants to accelerate application delivery, reducing costs, a common approach is to leverage containers. When we talk about essentially that mass migration space that I was in before, a container is a very good option when you want to think about taking that application, moving it to the cloud, and having some of the agility around the actual application in making sure that you can easily test it, making sure that you can easily deploy it in a reproducible manner, right? And this is especially compelling because customers want to be more effective and agile. They provide that option, or containers provide that option to essentially deliver applications, not only just quickly for development and operations teams that are really under that pressure, but at the same time, businesses know that essentially getting like software products and services to market, it translates into that gain share or that gain market share. And we've seen it. We've seen containers help modernize legacy applications and create net new cloud native applications that are both scalable and agile. So, you've probably heard about container frameworks like Docker, and you've probably heard about container orchestration systems like Kubernetes, right? And we have a plethora of material on that. But essentially, containers are providing that standardized way to package applications. You're packaging the code, you're packaging the runtime, you're bringing the libraries in, and you're running them across the entire software development lifecycle. And the cool thing is regardless of the environment, the expectation is the application behaves the same, right? It doesn't matter if it's the developer's laptop versus the production instance, it's still the same container image, right? And serverless, I'm going to try and do my best, but we have Mike, who's our serverless guru. But essentially, when we say serverless, right, we're talking about the removal of the heavy lifting that is server operations, right? And this is important for customers because essentially it's allowing them to focus on building just the application rather than thinking about things like management, scaling the infrastructure to support the application, right? And it also means that you're paying for what you value, and what that means is things like high availability and security are built in, right? So you don't necessarily need to think about like the traditional things of running things on top of EC2, or maybe you're thinking about auto scaling. All of that is built in because essentially, we do that work for you. You're paying for essentially what you use in terms of consumption. So, our serverless solution Lambda, it's essentially scaling by unit of work. You're paying for that billing model. So essentially, if you think about you have a value around throughput or execution duration, you're paying for that unit rather than the EC2 instance. And then at the same time too, like I said, it has that built-in availability and fault tolerance. So you don't need to think about how do I architect my application to run across multiple Amazon availability zones, because high availability is built into the service. So those are the two offerings that we see customers take advantage of when they're starting to think about how they're going to build microservices. But again, to reiterate it, it's not one or the other. It's usually a combination of both. So a lot of times what you'll say is, okay, well, what do I got to do different, right? Like that's now they're raising their hand. They're like, okay, I'm starting to get it. Like, where do I start? How do I do this differently? And for starters, you need to start thinking about your development process as a more iterative process. And iterative development is a key term in agile development methodologies. And really what it means, and again, to my point earlier, is it's that shorter development cycle, which is typically referred to as an iteration or sprint. You'll hear those terms. And during that time, the application changes are broken into these small chunks. Sometimes you'll hear them called as features, but each feature is designed, developed, and tested repeatedly. Right? That's the key piece. And the goal is to get to an evaluation stage where all of those prior changes that have been completed can be examined and if needed, iterated on again. Like you create this flywheel effect, right? And you'll also hear this term shifting left. And shifting left is another term that organizations really, really need to understand in terms of where do I need to start? What do I need to do differently? And what that means is you're taking all of the tasks and you're thinking about them as early as possible in the software development process, meaning you're coming up with tests, you're coming up with automation, you're trying to do everything possible to basically put the footprint down from an infrastructure as code and from a process standpoint to avoid issues later on, right? So it really means that it's not just throwing everything at your developers. They obviously have to take on more responsibility, but at the same time too, your operational teams, your security teams, they are key stakeholders. You have to enforce that collaboration between them because now there's this shared mindset. They need to work closely in order to define and create the testing process and essentially create a standard deployment process, which you'll typically see through the concept of CI/CD. Right? So your teams will work together to come up with patterns to create these consistent deployment models, regardless of the environment. And at the end of the day, the goal, you feel safe knowing that each environment has been thoroughly tested. And it doesn't necessarily matter if it was a QA release versus a staging release for a production release. You know that it's followed the same path. You know that the same tests have been executed, right? And that's the goal, is to instill confidence in that when you finally do go to push that button to push it to production, that you know that it's going to succeed, right? And I want to go one step further in all of this because I didn't mention it as part of the earlier shift left model. You really need to think about security, right? Security now becomes everyone's jobs. And developers need to understand that it's not about handing off an application to let another team implement security components, right? Everyone now has that stake, and they need to they need to think about that and it has to be factored in every single decision about how the applications are built, how it's tested, and how it's deployed. And the last thing, and I know Mike has a strong opinion on this one as well, is like you need to, and it's not on this slide, and you need to think about, what are your business differentiators, right? So if you're starting, this process and you're thinking about what you're doing differently, you need to spend your time engineering on what your customers care about and not necessarily look to reinvent the wheel, right? So you need to look to see where you can take advantage of things that have already been done, in terms of undifferentiated heavy lifting, where applicable, right? So like, again, focus on what your customers care about. Don't try and reinvent processes and things that have already been created by other teams. It's okay to take advantage of them, as needed. And maybe Mike can chime in a little bit more on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that that's one of the real kind of keys to increasing the rate at which your teams are able to innovate is provide them with that ability to be more focused. If your teams are spending a lot of cycles trying to worry about how do we manage patching, how do we manage deployment automation, how do we manage all scaling and auto scaling configurations and load balancing and keeping a RabbitMQ instance up and running and all of these types of other considerations that ultimately your customers don't care about. There are very few customers who go out and select a product because your teams are really great at managing highly available message brokers under the covers, right? That's not what your customers care about. They care about the features and the availability and the reliability of the service that you're providing. So the more time that you can spend engineering solutions to the problems that your customers care about, the more successful you're going to be and the faster you're going to be able to innovate.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, and so I, a couple of other points, as people start to make these types of transitions, we start to hear a couple of different questions. So one of the ones that commonly comes up is, okay, great, I like this idea of, two pizza teams. It sounds interesting. However, I'm really concerned that, my teams are going to spend a lot of time duplicating effort because you're telling me that they really shouldn't be sharing code. They shouldn't be, communicating with not communicating with each other, but they shouldn't be, making design and architectural decisions based on what the other people are doing. And this principle of, one solution to a problem is better than having multiple solutions to that same problem. Right, so this is oftentimes referred to as the drive principle. So do not repeat yourself, and is certainly a very common principle throughout software design and development, and certainly one that is true. You don't want to be solving the same problem over and over and over again, and it can lead to a number of different problems. However, this kind of concept where, hey, a single solution is better than having multiple solutions is incomplete. Really, the full inequality that we need to be looking at here is, yeah, one perfect solution is certainly better than having multiple, but having multiple solutions to a problem is way better than having zero. And oftentimes what happens when you get obsessed with reducing the amount of duplicated effort, you end up in this analysis paralysis mode where you've got architecture review boards that are spending months and months trying to design all of the various different shared services, and you have all of these different meetings and consensus panels to understand what is the scope of each one of these different shared services. And by the time you actually roll out one of these shared services, by the time you roll out the single solution to this problem, you've wasted months or even years in some cases of engineering time waiting for this common shared solution to happen, instead of letting teams own their own destiny and make decisions today based on what they need right now. And then after the fact, looking at commonalities and extracting those and figuring out how can we build where are the opportunities for us to build a new team or a new service that's now going to take care of this undifferentiated work that some of our teams have had to do on their own, but they did so in the interest of being able to move quickly for the time being. So I think that kind of not being afraid to duplicate a little bit of effort in the short term in order to move quickly is a really important mindset to kind of get into when it comes to looking at how you can modernize your culture overall. So Carmen, you want to talk a little bit about willingness to fail in that same kind of vein?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're seeing here, we call it the innovation flywheel. And what I hope you're getting out of this visual is essentially experimentation feeds into ideas, and along the way, you're going to fail, but guess what? Like, that's totally okay, because essentially you're just going to keep executing that circular motion, and it's going to lead to innovation, right? And it's going to lead to modernizing your application. To my point before about people talking about failing fast and learning mistakes, that's essentially what we're trying to represent with this slide here. Businesses want to drive growth. They want to accelerate their migrations with repeatable processes and patterns. They want to maximize their value as they modernize their applications. And without this type of flywheel, you can't innovate as quickly, right? And what you're trying to avoid, right? And what we're trying to represent with this slide is you don't want to get into that situation that I was talking about before, where you're not innovating and you're essentially incurring this technical debt, or maybe the blame game has started within your organization, because blame is toxic, right? It inhibits speed and it inhibits software development. And when you think about what you're trying to achieve, or what businesses are trying to achieve, they're trying to be agile. They're trying to essentially be quick to market. They want to look at the feedback. They want to collect it and analyze it as fast as possible. And they want to use that to react to their customers. And at the same time, too, they want to think about that data and use it as opportunities to reduce cost. So the more they can experiment on new ideas to potentially reduce cost while still providing, a valuable experience for the customers, that's what they're looking for. They want to get those ideas to market, because essentially, the quicker they get them to market, the more successful they are. Right. And at the end of the day, when you're looking at all of this, the one thing it's also super important here is you want to reduce future errors as you're doing this. This isn't just some haphazard thing where you're just, making changes left and right. The key thing that I hope you're taking away from today is again, we're trying to instill that process in there where you're thinking about how you can do the testing aspect as you go through the software release cycle, and trying to improve stability while you're pushing these changes out to your production environments.
Definitely. So, yeah, and I think that leads really well into this next idea about kind of how the actual development timeline changes once you start implementing some of these changes.
Yeah, and this is like the old way. I mean, in terms of the terms, they're very much similar when we talk about the net new way, right? But at the same time, you see this monolithic development timeline, right? And it's essentially each process or each phase is a separate team. And sometimes you'll see this, or you'll hear this term of throwing it over the fence, right? And at the end of the day, the end goal is obviously you want to have a successful production release for your customers. But because each team and all of their processes are siloed off from one another, it's very likely that there's going to be an issue the time that time to go live with that release. And we've probably all been in that situation where it's time to do our production release and it fails, right? And maybe it's something as simple as a package being outdated, or maybe that package hasn't been blessed by the security team and it's missing on your production server. Now the whole release fails because it was required, right? You need to avoid that level of isolation, right? Earlier on we talked about technical debt, and we talked about causes, right? This siloed approach is almost always an easy way to accumulate technical debt, because it leads to the lack of documentation, it leads to the lack of process or awareness, or lack of knowledge when it comes from your business and development teams, because they're essentially unaware of what's happening further on down the process chain, in order to actually successfully deploy and operationalize your application.
Yeah, so I think the solution to this problem is, as we've been discussing, is to really provide that framework where you've got individual teams that are able to own this process from end to end. Now, the important thing to note here is, like we talked about previously, you probably have separate teams that are responsible for various different concerns. There's probably a separate security team that's setting policy within your organization around compliance and governance and these various security standards. The point isn't to eliminate that team altogether. The point is to, one, migrate the responsibility for that function into the two pizza teams themselves, and then turn this team that used to be set up as a gating function, as a blocker to getting to production, turn them into a collaborative enabler for all of these various teams, where they provide both consultation as well as tooling that these teams can use to integrate into their processes earlier on. So instead of a security review not happening until right before you go to production, you want to be investing in mechanisms where each individual team can be doing security activities continuously throughout the development lifecycle. So integrating some sort of package scanning into the actual CI/CD process, so that as soon as a developer decides to add some new library or a new package, that's immediately getting scanned according to the standard security policies that your security team has set up. And now the development teams, these teams that are responsible for delivering customer value, can look to the security team as a collaborator and someone that they want to engage with in order to build a more secure and more robust product for their customers, as opposed to viewing them as a gating function or an obstacle that has to be overcome, and one that they would rather avoid interacting with if at all possible. So I think that ultimately that's really kind of the cultural change that you're trying to drive with this, is this idea that we want to encourage additional collaboration. And the way that you do that is you remove kind of that mechanism of, we have separate teams now that are set up as barriers to getting to production, and instead turn them into teams that help your delivery teams actually deliver on the customer value that they're trying to provide. So this concludes our prepared content for today. We really appreciate your time and attention, and we hope that you found all of this information useful.